I guess I have the pleasure to welcome you all back to panel number 4. My name is Daniel Tubb, and I am a fellow at the Agrarian Studies program as well. And our panel today is on small-scale swine, and we just have the 2 panelists. Robin is presenting tomorrow. So the first is Mark Essig, and he is a freelance writer and editor and the author of Lesser Beasts, A Snout-to-Tail History of the Humble Pig, which just recently came out. And our second panelist is Brad Weiss, who's a professor and chair of anthropology at William and Mary College and the author of several books, including Street Dreams and Hip-Hop Barbershops, Global Fantasy, and Popular Practice in Urban Tanzania. Although there's only 2 panelists, it's going to be the same format because we have to leave this room on time so that there's time for the keynote. So you'll each get 20 minutes and 5 minutes for questions. And then a discussion at the end.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. So this book, which came out a few months ago, is a history of pigs, mostly in the West, covers about 9,000 years in 60,000 words, and it relies heavily on the scholarship of others. So this is some of those others are in the room today at the conference. So it's my opportunity to say thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. I hope I did justice to your work, and if I didn't, let me know, and I'll try to fix it. I'm just going to read a few passages from the book selected with the title of this panel in mind. It's sort of a 20-minute forced march through the history of pig husbandry in America. A few New England towns look like the mother country, with cows grazing on town commons overseen by communally hired herders. But most farms told a different story. With no herders available, animals roamed the woods, finding food where they could and defending themselves against predators, or not, when necessity arose. Of the major livestock, only hogs truly thrived. On the ocean shores, pigs raided oyster banks and clam beds. In the woods, they found wild peas, vetches, roots, and mushrooms. In Carolina and Virginia, they roamed the orchards for windfall peaches, devouring the flesh, then deftly cracking the stone to get at the kernel inside. Pigs were said to be particularly fond of snakes, holding them down with one hoof, administering a killing bite, then sucking them down like noodles. Most of all, pigs ate nuts that fell from trees. The chestnut and oak trees once cultivated by Native Americans now provided food for pigs, a bounty unimagined in the forests of Eurasia. Lackadaisical farming was a rational response to these prevailing conditions. One observer explained that the farmers had little incentive to improve their practices because, quote, nature has been so profusely bountiful in bestowing the mediums of makeshift. When makeshift solutions proved so effective, when pigs fed themselves and multiplied beyond reckoning, why trouble with fussy English practices? The quality of the animals suffered from this hands-off approach, but the quantity did not. Reports from North America echoed those from the Caribbean 200 years before. The Virginian Robert Beverly noted, quote, hogs swarm like vermin upon the earth and find their own support in the woods without any care of the owner. There was money in all those hogs. William Pynchon of Springfield, Mass. Packed huge numbers of hogs to supply the West Indian market. As a Barbados planter explained to John Winthrop, Caribbean plantation owners, quote, had rather buy food at very dear rates than produce it by labor. So infinite is the profit of the sugar works. Cured meat became New England's second most important commodity for export, trailing only fish. That, incidentally, was part 1, colonial. This is part 2, pioneer. In the century after the American Revolution, backwoods farmers cleared and settled far more land than the Germanic people of Northern Europe had managed in a millennium. The American settlers did so using what geographer Terry Jordan Bishkoff has called the 4 essential elements of backwoods farming: corn, axes, fire, and pigs. Early 19th century travel diaries trace the spread of the pig across America. Quote, of all the domestic animals, hogs are the most numerous, Francois-André Michaud reported from Kentucky in 1802. A traveler in Ohio in 1817 reported that pork could be had, quote, in any quantity you please, because hogs, quote, run in the woods in great droves. In Illinois a year later, an English visitor named Elias Pym Fordham commented on the fecundity of both humans and swine. Quote, every log cabin is swarming with half-naked children. Boys of 18 build huts, marry, and raise hogs and children at about the same expense. Travelers' accounts also explain how those pigs were kept. In early Ohio, one man observed, hogs were almost as easily raised as the deer, and thousands were never seen by their owner until with his gun he went out and killed them. More often, farmers occasionally tossed out a little corn or salt to keep the pigs accustomed to having people around. In the spring, farmers roamed the woods to find new piglets and notch their ears as a mark of ownership. In the fall, one pioneer said, he would build a pen and leave a gate open. Quote, we put shelled corn in the pen and dribbled out a few long streaks through the woods. Them half-wild hogs would follow the traces of corn up to the pen, and then he would rush up and trap them. The pigs could then be fattened on surplus corn before slaughter. The semi-wild forest pig lay at the center of American pioneer culture. Abraham Lincoln described himself as a mast-fed lawyer, meaning that he had picked up an education in backwoods districts just as the local pigs fed themselves among the oaks and chestnuts. The pioneers had as many names for pigs as the Romans had for pork, most of them reflecting the animal's agility, toughness, and destructiveness. Woods pigs were called razorbacks, painters, rovers, thistle diggers, prairie sharks, land pikes, sapling splitters, rail splitters, stump suckers, elm peelers, piney woods rooters, and, puzzlingly, but perhaps because they were so hard to get a grip on, cucumber seeds. Three, the southern range. Like the rest of the country, southern states preserved an open range during the colonial period, granting livestock free run of all unfenced land. Most states in the East and Midwest changed course by 1850 or so, giving deed holders full control over their lands. The South, though, preserved its free-range customs until after the Civil War and in some areas until after World War II. Even the politically powerful railroads had to pay damages when their trains killed livestock. When a railroad company argued before the Georgia Supreme Court in 1860 that a plaintiff had been negligent in allowing his horse to wander into the path of an oncoming train, the justices rejected the argument. If this were true, the court wrote, that a man, quote, could not walk across his neighbor's unenclosed land, nor allow his horse or his hog or his cow to range in the woods. In the South, the common people's rights in the woods, which allowed them to hunt, fish, and keep livestock on any unfenced land, were held sacred, because without those rights, many would have starved. The 1850 census revealed that per capita, there were more swine in the South than in the Corn Belt, suggesting that nearly every Southerner acquired a few pigs, notched their ears, and turned them loose in the forest. And the census surely undercounted those Southern pigs, since owners could easily lower their tax bills by underreporting their pigs. Quote, you can keep as many pigs as you wish, and you need not feed them, a German visitor wrote in a letter home. We can live here like lords. A prosperous farmer in the Blue Ridge Mountains described how an impoverished men could move to the region and with the aid of free mast for their hogs, build a nice little happy home. He concluded, truly, it is a paradise for the poor man. Southern leaders began to close the range after the Civil War, and their main purpose was to take food out of the mouths of the poor. Under prevailing law, free African Americans might have adopted the habits of plain white folk and earned an independent living through herding, hunting, and fishing. A newspaper editor in Virginia explained the implications of this for the Southern economy. Laborers, he wrote, if, quote, furnished with free food, would neglect agriculture, end quote. Legislatures in every state closed the range on a county-by-county basis, starting in areas with the largest populations of freed slaves. A newspaper claimed that this change affected only, quote, lousy Negroes and lazy white men, and would be good for both. Now they would find work as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. This was indeed the effect. though few, black or white, would find reason to celebrate it. As poor Southerners were forced into the post-Reconstruction economy, pig populations began to dwindle. Historians examined 6 counties in Alabama and Mississippi and found that before the Civil War, residents had owned 2.1 hogs per capita. After the war, it was 0.4. The effect on the common folk was plain to see. If travelers to the South before the Civil War tended to mock Southerners for their laziness, those who came after pitied those same people for their poverty, misery, and hunger. In the 1880s, one writer described the closing of the range as, quote, another step in the oppression of the poor. 4, the Corn Belt. When pioneers cleared out, another type of settler moved in. The new farmers settled the best farmland, generally river bottom lands that Native Americans had cultivated for centuries. They leapfrogged their way west, settling the valleys of the Scioto, Miami, Wabash, and other rivers. By the 1850s, better plows made it possible to break up the prairie sod, wetlands were drained, more trees were cleared, and the Corn Belt, a continuous 500-mile region stretching from Ohio to Iowa, was formed. Corn paired with pigs fueled the rapid settlement of the U.S. An acre of corn produced 3 to 6 times as much grain as an acre of wheat. One sown seed of wheat might yield 50 at harvest. A single corn kernel produced 150 to 300. Only rice, a far more labor-intensive crop, produced at similar rates. The farmers grew breathtaking amounts of corn, but they didn't eat it. They preferred wheat bread. In their minds, corn wasn't food, it was feed. The practice of fattening livestock with grain dates back at least to ancient Mesopotamia, but North American farmers were the first to apply it on a vast scale. Whereas South America had become a major meat exporter, raising cattle on grassland, Midwestern farmers turned grassland into cornfields and fed the corn to hogs and cattle. One early Corn Belt farmer described a system of fattening cows and pigs together in the same fields. Quote, the cattle were not housed or sheltered, but simply fed twice a day in the open lots of 8 or 10 acres each, with unhusked corn with the other fodder, and followed by hogs to clean up the waste and offal. There were no barns, which kept capital costs down, and the feeding method reduced labor costs as well. Rather than harvesting ears of corn, they shocked the stalks, gathering them into large upright bundles and left them in the fields. The cattle then ate the silage as well as the corn kernels off the ear. After the cows had eaten, it was the pigs' turn. They ate the kernels that had escaped the attention of the cows, as well as many that had not. Cow digestive systems adapted to cellulose were inefficient at processing grains, and the pigs enjoyed a great deal of corn that had already made one trip through a cow. As historian Alan Bogue has explained, for cattle feeders, the margin of profit was often represented by the nutriment that his hogs gleaned from the droppings of steers. 5, industrial packing. The Corn Belt produced so many hogs that it required a new method of processing. The modern line, fully developed by the 1860s, started with pigs being driven up a ramp known as the Bridge of Sighs in Chicago to the top floor of a 2 or 3-story plant. A worker attached a chain to a rear leg of each pig and hooked the other end of the chain to an overhead rail which hoisted the animal, kicking and squealing into the air. The sticker plunged a knife into the pig's neck, and blood poured out of the wound and through a latticed floor, to be collected in barrels below. Now dead, the pig was plunged into a tank 20 feet long and 6 feet wide, filled with water kept near boiling by a continuous flow of steam. Men standing alongside used short poles to keep the line of hogs bobbing along the trough, rolling them over to ensure an even scald that would loosen the hair. At the end of the tank, a rake-like device lifted the carcass and dumped it onto an inclined table with 8 or 9 men on each side. Their job was to scrape off the hog's hair. The first 2 took only the bristles, valuable for use in brushes, along the spine. The carcass then slid or rolled down to the next men in the line, who used short-handled hose or sharp knives to scrape and shave the hair from every bit of the pig. At the end of the table, 2 men attached a stick called a gambrel. that stretched the rear legs apart, then hooked the gambrel to an overhead track known as the railroad, so that the pig swung free of the table, hanging from its splayed feet. Propelled by gravity or a steam-driven chain, the pig carcass started down the line. At the first station, 2 men sprayed it with cold water to wash away loose hair and filth. Then the railroad made a series of stops at 4-foot intervals. The dry shaver removed stray hairs. The gut man slashed the belly open with a single stroke, allowing the intestines to pour out. The organ man removed the heart, liver, and other innards. Finally, another man with a hose sprayed out the interior of the carcass. Each worker had just 12 seconds to perform his task. The hog then rolled off to the cooling room to await butchery the next day. The first true assembly line is credited to the one that made Model Ts, and Henry Ford later claimed that the idea was borrowed in part from pork packers. A moving line of pigs or cars not only cut down on heavy lifting, but also set the pace of the work. Each slaughterhouse worker had just seconds to perform his task before another pig arrived. It was rough on the workers, but the rate of production soared. The genius of the Packers disassembly line and the Model T assembly line, Ford explained, lay in their bringing, quote, the work to the men instead of the men to the work. The pork line became a standard stop for journalists and tourists visiting Chicago. Great as this wonderful city is in everything, a British traveler said, the first place among its strong points must be given to the celerity and comprehensiveness of the Chicago style of killing hogs. That comprehensiveness extended to the use of the carcass. The list of byproducts is nearly endless. Bristles became brushes, finer hairs stuffed mattresses. Tankage, the solid bits strained from rendered fats, were ground into feed for pigs and chickens. Bones were stamped into buttons, cooked to make gelatin, or smoldered into charcoal for use in sugar refining. Hooves were boiled down for glue. Prussian blue, a dye used by printers, was derived from blood. Extracts from glands and organs, pepsin and other enzymes, various hormones, and more served as raw materials for the pharmaceutical industry. Pig byproducts gave packers an incentive to grow large. Small-scale slaughtering didn't produce a marketable amount of blood, hair, or bones, but killing thousands of animals a day changed the equation. A large packing house might pay $10 for a live hog and sell its meat for $9.75, but it didn't lose money. The profit margin came from selling the byproducts that small packers threw away. That meant big packers could pay higher prices for pigs, allowing them to force out smaller competitors. Cincinnati packers in the 1850s paid on average 5% more than competitors elsewhere. Farmers benefited, so did consumers, whose prodigious pork consumption was subsidized by the sale of pork byproducts. I'm going to skip over industrial farming because I think that's been pretty well covered at this conference. I only want to point out that it's so recent, modern confinement agriculture. What we would call pastured pork today was all pork in 1940 or so. And I just want to point out one statistic. This is from the USDA. In 1950, there were 3 million farms in the US raising hogs, 3 million. And in 2012, there were about 50,000. So from 3 million to 50,000 in 65 years or so. And my final section is on pastured pigs. Chuck Talbot, who has a PhD in animal science and now raises pigs near Charleston, West Virginia, runs a high-end curing operation called Woodlands Pork. The pigs, a blend of heritage breeds with some wild boar mixed in, spend their final months in the woods eating acorns and other wild foods. Then his partners process and cure the meat, producing a pricey American ham to rival the best from Europe. Talbot explains the dilemma of modern pork in these terms. You've got the rich farmers feeding the poor families and the poor farmers feeding the rich families, which is to say big corporations run by wealthy executives sell bacon for $3 a pound at Walmart while struggling farmers like him offer it at farmers market for 4 times that price. Or maybe they sell it at Chipotle. Chipotle, which claims to use pork only from pigs raised on pasture or in pens with deep beds of straw, released a 2-minute animated film titled Back to the Start in 2011. The story, which has no dialogue, begins with a young farmer joined by his wife and baby working a bucolic small farm with pigs on pasture. He then builds an enormous factory where his pigs are pumped full of feed and drugs before being packed into boxes and driven away on trucks. Finally, an old man with a grown son, the farmer dismantles the factory and turns it back into a farm with pigs on pasture once again. On the soundtrack, Willie Nelson sings a Coldplay song. I'm going to read this, not sing it. Science and progress don't speak as loud as my heart. I'm going back to the start. It's a heartwarming tale and not entirely inaccurate. In America and Europe, a growing number of farmers are embracing more traditional forms of agriculture. But that's only a small slice of the story. In the developing world, especially China and Brazil, farmers are moving in the opposite direction. They're giving up old-fashioned ways and raising pigs in confinement barns because they can make a lot of money doing so. In only the latest controversy in the long history of swine, some people are tearing down confinement barns out of ethical concerns as others raise them up for financial reasons. It's a question of values and prices. How much is a happy pig worth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for 5 minutes for questions.
I'm not off the hook yet.
Anyone questions?
Any comments on Nyman Ranch being bought by Purdue, if that's something you're familiar with, the largest cooperative of?
Yeah. Mixed thoughts, mostly pessimistic. As I think was discussed at the roundtable last night, it's easy for big ag with a lot of money to co-opt good farming practices. Another part of me is trying to be hopeful about it, because what it means is that people do care about these things. Chipotle, when they were first experienced their pork shortage, they had a problem last year with one of their suppliers not following the required protocols, and so they had a disastrous nationwide carnitas shortage. There was a lot of commentary that said this shows that this is bad for them, but I thought it was good. It actually highlighted that they were doing something different that could cause supply problems. And so I think the key will be somebody needs to hold their feet to the fire, as has been discussed previously, the need for third-party certification systems to guarantee that these things are actually what they say they are, and there's other steps that could be taken, like the banishing of the word natural from all meat packaging. So I guess that just says that I have mixed feelings.
Yeah, obviously the centrality of pigs to the pioneering process of expansion in the United States also suggests a centrality to the dispossession of resident indigenous populations wherever that form of agriculture spread across the continent. I'm assuming we'll be hearing about this to some degree tomorrow on the panel on imperialism and colonialism, but in your book and in your narrative of pigs and particularly in the United States expansion, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about pigs being part of that process of dispossession and whether they were ever specifically targeted when resident indigenous populations resisted that expansion.
Yeah, that absolutely happens. I do discuss it in my book. There's a good book from which I borrow liberally, Creatures of Empire. Anderson is the name of the author there. And yeah, they did so. You read a lot of complaints about pigs be spoiling the clam banks that indigenous peoples had relied on for food, rooting up food caches that they had stored, destroying. There were a lot of marsh lilies that were important in in the diets of Aboriginal peoples, and concerns. I quote from an official in Oregon who was very concerned about starvation of some of the native tribes there because the pigs were destroying all of their food resources. I don't recall anything about pigs being targeted. It was actually the one type of livestock that a lot of Native Americans embraced because they were so easy. Like, and a lot of times the colonists would try to force cows upon them because it would force them to adopt regular habits. They would, like, particularly dairy cows, you have to milk them regularly. But they didn't want to have anything to do with those because it was too much work. Whereas as the deer were disappearing, the pigs, for Native Americans, functioned as a replacement for deer. You just turned them loose in the woods and you hunted them down when you needed them, and you didn't have to. They liked them for the same reason that the early colonists and later pioneers liked them.
I just wanted to ask, looking at the whole heritage of the feral swine that's been presented here today, it keeps coming to my mind, and just kind of an open thought that with the new type of hogs, all the hog producers now are drawing from primarily one or two genetic fields, and in most states in the U.S., the feral hog is becoming extinct because they're thinking they're disease factors to these large operations. So, what is going to become, in your opinion, if we're drawing from one gene pool with genetics that it's more on the confinement building hog rather than the heritage hog, what's going to become in the future when we have nothing to draw from?
Did you say that? I don't think that the feral pigs certainly aren't in any danger of being wiped out. They're very good at surviving. Texas has a couple million of them, and try as they might to eradicate them, they won't. I'm concerned about the way industrial hog producers raise their hogs, but I think that there are quite a few people working on the conservation of heritage breeds. I don't think that that's actually one thing. I'm generally a pessimist, but that's actually one thing I'm optimistic about. I think there are more people preserving enough animals to serve as a reservoir for when I hope we go back to more sensible forms of agriculture.
On that optimistic note, we're going to move on to the next panelist, and we'll have some more time at the end for conversation.
Okay. Well, I have to thank Jim and Gabe and everybody else for inviting me to this really incredibly interesting, stimulating, thought-provoking conference. I have learned an enormous amount about my own work as well as everybody else's work. And what I'm going to say is going to dovetail directly out of some of the things that Mark said. Chuck tablet figures in my work as well, and Nyman Ranch is in this talk, and goes directly to the last question that we had. So, without further ado, let me thank you for that, and also point out that the work that I want to speak about today is part of a book that's currently in press called Real Pigs, which is derived from field research that I carried out across central North Carolina for 6 years, looking at small-scale pasture-raised pig production, processing, marketing, and consumption. In this time, I came to understand that a range of values, and often rather diverse, even contradictory missions, motivated the many people that participated in this local pork movement. But I also found that most of them, from first-generation farmers to farmers, market customers to agricultural extension officers, characterized their work as in some ways interested in, as many of them put it, what they called being authentic. It's this pursuit of authenticity that is the problem embedded in Real Pigs. That is the book that I'm bringing out. Moreover, the notoriously slippery value of authenticity is also generally understood by the folks that I've worked with to embody what many of them call a connection that people like farmers and shoppers and parents and entrepreneurs hope to create or provide or simply experience. This can be a connection with food, with a landscape, with neighbors, or with the lives and welfare of pigs. My comments today turn on these ethnographic categories and commitments to authenticity, as it is grasped as a form of connection. And I hope to show how these commitments are understood and embodied in a particular, what I'm calling genre of pig, and that is heritage breed pigs, and a specific kind of heritage breed pig at that, namely what you're looking at here, the Ossabaw Island hog, which we heard about just yesterday. These pigs, however, are descendants of those feral pigs from Ossabaw Island. In his excellent study of the evolutionary history of the industrial hog, Sam White, who I gather spoke here not too long ago, describes the way that Chinese stock played a central role in the transformation of the English pig. These small, fat, black pigs from Asia, introduced into Europe in the early 18th century, had been kept for centuries, converting household scraps and agricultural leavings into edible protein. This physiological capacity made them well suited to improve the rangy, hairy European hogs that fed primarily on forest mast. By means of this hybridizing encounter, a burgeoning market in southeastern England for improved hogs raised in sties, trough-fed and fattened on peas and beans, when not scavenging London's backyards, would be fed by farmers in the Midlands of Leicestershire and Lincolnshire. Now, this transformation in the hybrid English pig was also a revolution in its symbolic form. The expansion of English markets for pork, facilitated by newfangled pigs raised on farms dedicated to their production, was further facilitated by promoting specific breeds of livestock, which allowed customers across England to recognize those pigs with the distinctive characteristics they preferred. So Robert Bakewell, a pioneer in the promotion of livestock breeds from the late 18th century, held that, as he put it, the new idea of breed was from the beginning nothing more than, as he put it, an ingenious marketing and publicity mechanism. And so the market played a critical early role in formalized selective breeding. Whether such ideas are ever, as he put it, nothing more than a marketing device is one of the questions I pursue here. The issues I raise for contemporary North Carolina are relevant for considering the relationship between selection, quality, and reproduction, which are really the focus of what I'm going to talk about here. Early adopters of these Chinese pigs facilitated a proliferation of English breeds across the countryside. How some of those pigs ended up as heritage breeds, while others are relegated to the ignominy of industrial standardization, is itself an intriguing historical question. But in this talk, I address a slightly different problem. What kind of thing, I ask, is a heritage livestock breed? What is the purchase on variation in forms of life that is afforded to us by codifying specific breeds and endowing them with distinctive qualities, especially such semiotically charged qualities as heritage? Addressing such problems entails a consideration of the relationship between the production of livestock breeds and concomitant efforts to market these animals and their meat. As I demonstrate, animal production and marketing is a recursive process, as the criteria to which livestock are bred may themselves be transformed as discerning consumers seek different characteristics, as they put it, in the breed. This recursivity is relevant to an understanding of social and cultural forms of typification, the practices by which categories are established and confirmed in social life. At the widest level, I argue that this concern with categories is a useful way to think about questions of materiality and immateriality. Breeds are concepts that express preferences, interests, and other conventional notions, all contingent on a variety of contexts. At the same time, breeding animals to these types is an intrinsically material process, requiring the skilled selection of animals, as well as a grasp of the wider husbandry practices, environmental conditions, and the physiological well-being of particular animals that are all conducive to successful livestock reproduction. What is it, then, that is materialized in the category of breed? What concrete qualities are rendered in the creation of heritage breeds? I argue that the distinction between breeds as definitive types or categories of life and breeding, a process of selection and biosocial reproduction in animal husbandry, is characterized by a number of tensions that inform the production of categories like specialty, or occasionally you hear in England pedigree, or in the United States heritage. And these have implications for the social conditions under which such animals are produced and circulate. So let's think a little bit about the Ossabaw Island hog itself. These pigs are descendants of the Iberico pig, or pata negra, originally brought to the New World in 1539 with Spanish colonial forces. Abandoned, and here I'll show you on the map. Yep, there's Ossabaw Island. Abandoned or perhaps shipwrecked on the Atlantic coast, a feral colony of these Ibericos survived in isolation from domestic pigs on the sea island of Ossabaw, just off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, which is right below Savannah there. The island remained largely undeveloped through the end of the 20th century, and the hogs there acquired the characteristic qualities of something we heard about this morning, namely insular dwarfism, becoming smaller in overall size, but possessed of a remarkable physiological ability to store fat. This propensity has made this particular herd of interest to medical researchers studying metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and heart disease, who first began removing and then actually actively breeding Ossabaw hogs from Ossabaw Island in 2002. The medical uses of the Ossabaw were facilitated by their environmental impact on the Ossabaw Island habitat, as we also heard about yesterday. The porcine colony was making efficient use of the limited food supplies on the island by voraciously eating the eggs of such endangered species as the loggerhead sea turtle, any number of nesting birds, and assorted, often protected reptiles and amphibians. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources developed a management plan in 2000 that actually called for the eradication of the island's feral hog population. What would become the heritage breed was only saved from this fate by the medical interest in the hogs that began exporting the hogs from Ossabaw Island and breeding them for medical research. The selective breeding of Ossabaw Island hogs, then, is rooted in a complex history, one that extends from a colonial expansion through environmental management to biomedical research. The history of these hogs poses some problems for the study of breeds. For example, Ossabaw Island hogs were deposited on Ossabaw Island in the mid-16th century, well before the notion of distinct recognizable livestock breeds was developed in Europe. In the course of 400 years of inbreeding and environmental adaptation, the Ossabaw Island hog developed phenotypic and perhaps, the jury's out a little bit, perhaps genotypic characteristics that distinguish them as a population. But it is entirely unclear that the Iberian pigs had any such prior connections to one another. This fact makes the, in some ways, obvious but by no means trivial point that breeds as such are historical phenomena. Yet the Ossabaw presents the perhaps anomalous history of being a breed that was not selectively bred through techniques of careful livestock husbandry, but left to naturally evolve through their abandonment in a resource-poor environment, a long-term process that generated animals which are both physiologically compromised, prone to human-like metabolic ailments, and as it turns out, distinctively delicious. This genealogy seems to beg the question, what makes a breed of pigs a breed? How do their historical characteristics as a breed give them a discernible heritage? And how, I ask, can we situate these historical characteristics and qualities within the transformations of central North Carolina in political economy, demography, and pig farming that have swept across this region in recent decades, and again goes directly to Mark's point at the end about the vast number of farms that once existed, now the much smaller number of farms that exist, but the massive increase in the population of those hogs on those farms, and so that North Carolina is a story in miniature of exactly that transformation. One way to pursue these questions is to look directly at the discourse and activities of those most interested in identifying and promoting heritage breeds of swine. So here I'm a quote from a lengthy conversation I had with program managers of the Livestock Conservancy in Pittsboro, North Carolina. Here I'm quoting from a woman. One of the bigger things to tackle with pigs is not just breeding them, but breeding them correctly so that you've got a good body type, good traditional body type, and not turning them into a commercial hog. For instance, with the Berkshire, the vast majority of them out there are not Berkshire. They've got Hampshire in them, and they're kind of commercialized at this point. And so getting people to understand that there's something to the old body types and why that's important for the particular breeds. With the swine initiative, we're hoping to create guidelines to help people get people to understand, okay, what are you looking at when you're looking at the hog? What's a good back look like? What do good feet look like? What qualities should you insist upon for your breeders? It's like buyer beware when you're buying hogs. We tell people, do your homework. Know what a good hog looks like. Now, this manager emphasizes the way the breeds are characterized by a particular, I'll go on to serve some good hogs. This manager emphasizes the way that breeds are characterized by, as she puts it, particular qualities. Moreover, the notion of qualities is especially apt in this context, as it entails both recognizable characteristics as well as hierarchical evaluation. That is, good hogs bred correctly are preferable in some recognizable ways to other pigs. There is, as she says, something to those old body types. This theme of quality is an important one that resonates with the claims and practices of farmers, as well as chefs and consumers working with pastured pigs and their pork. Even her very brief comments demonstrate the ways that breeds and breeding are complicated by marketing and commerce. an abiding theme in the breeding of livestock. The significance of heritage, then, needs to be grasped as a term of distinction that offers a contrast to the industrial production of pigs that dominates the state. Even as the term heritage also has market value that facilitates the production and productivity of heritage breed pigs as commodities. In this way, heritage carries with it the uneasiness of alternative practices that nonetheless depend upon wider structures of practice to sustain them. Heritage pigs, in other words, would have little value in the absence of their industrial counterparts. Two more relevant points I want to make. First, the idea of breed conservancy as a practice that distinguishes one heritage population from a commercial other supports the values of authenticity that are central to the ways that these animals are marketed and that motivate the practices of so many participants in this niche. Such an unsullied line connotes a sense of that which is uniquely real and not modified or corrupted for commercial or commodified interests. Further, it should also be clear that in addition to implying that holding oneself at a remove from the market constitutes these animals and husbandry practices as somehow more real, connecting Spanish and European, as most heritage breeds are held to be of English origin, connecting Spanish ancestry through U.S. geography to contemporary North Carolina practitioners provides a distinct and different line of preservation, one that is also fictively rooted in blood. This lineage suggests the social distinctiveness of the people who inhabit this world, equipped to appreciate a heritage, the something in those bodies, which they can also affiliate themselves. In this way, these attributes of a breed provide an alibi or a materialization of racial ideologies, a point that I addressed in more detail in the book and that I might be able to get to today if I have enough time. How do breeders and those interested in livestock breeding understand how the qualities that distinguish a heritage breed are embodied in these animals, not just conceptualized, but embodied? Just what was this something that distinguished the old body types? So I asked, this time another manager, are you conserving genetics? Is that the idea? And his response was this: well, I think you're preserving genetics, but in preserving a breed or the genetics of a breed, you have to be mindful of the management style or the way the breeding herd is maintained generation after generation, because the effects, positively or negatively, are what we're selecting for. We're not just selecting for conformation, we're selecting for performance. You know, is it going to give you the muscling or the fat, the back fat that you're looking for? Is it going to be desirable by the end consumer chef? There's a lot of variables there. End of his quotation. The overall performance of the animal is the outcome of a selection process that is carried out by certain management techniques. These questions of performance are particularly important because they reveal the ways that selection is guided by efforts to produce and reproduce identifiable qualities that are simultaneously features of animal lives, old body types, good feet, muscling, as well as these animals' performance as desirable, consumable meat. Consideration of performance in this way allows us to situate breeding, as well as the wider value of heritage breeds and the practices by which that value is materialized, in a wider context of social activities. Seeing a breeding process as directed by a concern with what is most desired by the end consumer allows us to incorporate a wider network of perspectives on chefs and consumers, and this network of perspectives is really one of the frameworks that guides my book as a whole. At the same time, the very notion of performance suggests an effort to carefully distinguish heritage from commodity forms, even as the central qualities of the heritage pig are realized when the pig becomes, in fact, a consumable commodity. That's what performance means. Given its use in the world of industrial livestock, which also has an interest in performance, using performance in these ways creates a kind of point of differentiation between commercial production and heritage breeding, or if you like, a kind of switch point. It applies to both forms, but also serves to differentiate them, we might say. In this way, performance is rather like breed conservancy. It points to an effort to distinguish putatively real porcine character and quality from adulterated, commodified purposes. Performance, then, is a way to connect certain qualifications while distancing others in the form of heritage breeds that are distancing heritage breeds from, as I said, from industrial or conventional types of animals. Now, I don't have time to discuss the way that the perspectives of the pigs themselves contribute to the cultivation of qualities in the breeding process, but I do address that in the longer chapter, so I'm happy to talk about that if I can. Now, here I focused on quality and performance, terms that are used by heritage pig breeders and activists to describe their particular goals. This draws attention to the way that heritage management is inextricably bound to concerns with the commodification of the pig and their pork, that a breed can be diminished by commercial motivations, and that performance can only be evaluated by discerning customers whose capacity for recognizing quality occurs after the heritage breed animal has been processed and rendered as commodified meat. And with only the brief time that I have left, I want to show how this tension between distinctive qualities in the breed and the commercial potential of these animals is embedded in the very category of the breed itself. I don't, unfortunately, have time to address the fascinating relationship between breeds and brands that was proposed to me by one of the farmers that I work with, but instead I want to address the connection between breeds and hybrids and return once again to the Ossibas. As I noted above, Ossibas are small, slow-growing, fatty pigs, and on the particular farm that I worked in North Carolina where these pigs are raised, the Ossibas are often crossed with other breeds of pigs in order to produce a faster-growing, larger pig. Now, there's no attempt to deny the presence of the non-Ossiba genetics in the livestock that are produced. Nobody's trying to get away with something and sell off these crossed animals as pure Ossiba, or to suggest that the new form of heritage, that you've created some new kind of heritage breed. You haven't. But rather, what the farmer is trying to do is to recognize that the viability of the Ossiba as a commercial form of livestock, an animal bred for the performance of its pork, depends on expanding the potential of that heritage breed. At Cane Creek, the pig of choice with which to cross the Ossiba is the one that you're looking at here, the farmer's hybrid, a larger animal that yields cuts of meats that can be sold more profitably than those from pure Ossiba. On farmer's hybrid, much beloved, known by the name of Bill Clinton. The farmer's hybrid is of much wider importance in national efforts to revitalize natural and pasture pork production, as it was, in fact, critical to the development of the Nyman Ranch brand, because they promoted the use of farmers' hybrids for the farmers that they were trying to do outreach with to get them to start to raise pigs on pasture, as the Nyman Ranch brand promoted. So again, the farmer's hybrid itself entails a wide network of perspectives, a network of discerning chefs, retail outlets like Whole Foods, and farmers that were familiar or becoming familiar with outdoor hog production practices. So even if the farmer's hybrid are not actually crossbred with these heritage breeds like the Ossiba, their presence is in fact already built into the material conditions that make such breeds possible. It's impossible to imagine heritage breeds in the absence of hybrids like this one, which provide a commercial outlet for the sale and production and growth of raising heritage breeds as a commodity form. And so what this means is, as I said, it's impossible to imagine heritage breeds in the absence of hybrids. It's only once the definitive characteristics of the properly performing animals have been materialized that the breed of that animal can, in fact, be known through its performance. In this way, a breed is the product of hybridization. Grounded in an entangled history of improved breeding techniques, heritage pigs simultaneously confirm and challenge the impetus to develop a commercial industry in livestock. Their heritage is critical to their niche standing, but this value-added position also renders them vulnerable, for the temptation to commercialize the breed through the specialized value that heritage commands may lead to the loss of the very genetic profile that defines the heritage breed. The importance of performance in a breed provides the opportunity for a series of qualifications and requalifications as physiological and anatomical features of a breed that can be selected for, which will in turn permit the qualification of particular kinds of products, bacons, loins, fat, etc., that can in turn be requalified via, for example, value-added processing like charcuterie, cooking, etc. In addition to performance, then, the role of hybrids in livestock husbandry reveals how the commercial viability of niche markets in heritage breeds is underwritten by an ongoing history of improvement and transformation, and not simply preservation and continuity. Finally, the notion of breeds as brand, which I haven't elaborated on here, provides a means for both articulating and concretizing the values of direct, forthright forms of social practice that provide an alternative to the industrial food system. The care and craft of the livestock breeder, indeed the honest labor of an actual farmer you can meet and look in the eye, as many of the customers that I work with would put it, are conveyed in the way that heritage breeds serve to brand the authenticity of these tactile encounters. So I'm actually demonstrating the own authenticity of my productivity as well by showing you the farmer at work in the field, or the anthropologist doing field work, as it were. The preference for heritage breed pork among these farmers, consumers, and others committed to innovation suggests the ways that heritage works to provide a kind of narrative of realness and unadulterated intentions. Yep. The temporal depth and sense of enduring place sought by in-migrating innovators and readily encountered in these porcine lives bespeaks the way that such breeds embody a desire for preservation amidst displacement. They also indicate, as well, the exclusionary potential of such semiotic and material processes through the ascription, for example, of breed conservancy or the notion of an ineffable something that distinguishes crass commercial creatures from those that are worthy of heritage. In both of these respects, as sources of innovative practice and modes of socio-semiotic differentiation, it's only a slight exaggeration to suggest that today's food activists quite closely resemble the Ossabaw hogs themselves. Transplanted into new territories, their exceptional qualities can be recognized and cultivated as they introduce new possibilities for remaking their local order. A bunch of Duke grads, I might add. Outsiders made local, we might say. Both esteemed qualities, swine with heritage, entrepreneurial farmers with local sustainability, locavores with ethical concerns, they all craft an innovative future. So thank you very much.
So I wanted to thank Brad, and we have 5 minutes for questions, and then 5 minutes for conversation, because I'm under strict instructions that we have to be out of here by for the coffee break at 1:45. So.
Thanks, Brad. That was great. I have a question about, well, so in addition to the breed as brand, which goes back to Bakewell, there's also the sense of breed as transmission, that breed is, and this is in some of the sources that I've looked at, breed is a metaphor in a way for inheritance, that some people say it was adopted, or they're saying at the turn of the 19th century it was adopted precisely because it denotes transmission in a way that race didn't at the time, for instance, right? Because people did call them races of livestock. And that got me thinking about metaphors for inheritance, which is something that seems at least to be resolved when we enter the era of kind of modern genetical knowledge and DNA, and the Ossabaw pigs that you're talking about, we feel like we have a firm grasp on how their traits, how their qualities are actually conveyed from generation to generation. But it's striking to me that the farmers, the producers you're working with, are using many of the same metaphors that people used prior to this, modern, so-called modern knowledge. So that was an observation that I'd love to get your take on. But the question attached to that is, given that the Ossabaw is like a little bit of an outlier or an interesting case in heritage breeds because of its utility as a medical model, how different is the breeding, the hogs the animals that are bred to model like diabetic humans? How different is that from the way that they're bred, and is the language different, and et cetera?
What was the? Tell me the metaphor that you used again. Is for transmission? Is that what?
I can look up the quotation for you. But it's but livestock breeders adopt breed in part because it denotes a sense of transmission absent elsewhere.
That's part of what I'm trying to capture by pointing out the distinction between breeds and breeding, and that breeds implies a sort of a type, a category. But when you get into the practice of breeding, you're talking about something that is more that is emergent, because it has to do with, it's like, as when we talk about somebody who has good breeding, for example, right? We mean something that's cultivated, we mean something that's produced over time in the course of their lives through the cultivation and engendering of particular kinds of qualities. And the way that's talked about by these master breeders, by these livestock people, is what they call performance. And that's not at all the genetic heritage of these animals. I mean, the genetic heritage of these Ossabaws is highly dubious. I mean, it's just extremely problematic. Nobody, until 2002, nobody was carefully monitoring there's a pretty good assumption it's a small insular population that for 400 years has been in one place. They're all genetically typical, identical. Well, they're widely shared. It's not how clear it is, though, how different they are genetically. That's why I sort of emphasize phenotype much more than genotype, as even as these breed folks do as well. But they emphasize how important it is to keep, what they're trying to, when they talk about preserving a breed, they talk about how a breed is not, and this is where I was trying to push against this notion, how a breed is not the product of of mixture, it really has these distinctive qualities that get preserved. At the same time, they recognize that, well, it gets preserved by husbandry, not so much by. There was something else that you were, not too much by genetics per se, not pure genetics. There was some other point that you got to that I want to speak about as well, and I can't recall what it is now because it was such a rich question. But anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah, ordinarily I try not to make comments without questions, but I'm going to make a comment without a question. I wanted to add a word of caution to your, what I thought was optimistic last sentence or two. The actual real-world breeding of heritage breed pigs is unfortunately very careless. The vast majority of people that are currently breeding heritage breed pigs are, like I was, new farmers who are not aware of the science and technique behind breeding. And so what they're doing is a sow will have 8 piglets, let's say a heritage breed sow, a Gloucester Old Spot, let's say, will have 8 piglets. And this so-called breeder will offer 8 piglets for sale as breeding stock, when in fact maybe one of them is valuable as breeding stock.
Yep.
And so the future of the heritage breeds is actually a little bit questionable because we're losing all of the qualities that the heritage breeds had to careless breeding. And so that's something that
I do not mean to imply that absolutely affirms what I'm trying to say as well. I mean, for one thing, that's exactly why there is a livestock breed conservancy, because there's this recognition, as the manager says right from the beginning, you know, you got to be careful because heritage itself has commercial value. That is, when you say I'm raising a Berkshire pig, I'm raising a Gloucestershire Old Spot, what you're doing is you're creating a market niche, even as you're trying to distinguish yourself from, you know, the perils of commercialization. What you're doing is commercializing that type, that breed. And you're absolutely right. And the woman I work with who raises these Ossibas is really worried because, and she more or less has stopped providing feeder pigs or you know, breeders for other folks, because she said, you know, they're running down the genetics is the way that is the way the farmers and other activists would put it, that they end up, as she said, squirrely pigs. They go slightly stir crazy, or they're not, you know. And again, it's because two reasons that I think I'm trying to get at in this paper. One, that there's this, that the temptations of commercialization are extremely strong, and there's enormous pressures to, you know, to create a market for these kinds of pigs. And two, that it isn't, as you said, these are new farmers, and it's really not, and conservancy is not primarily about just the genetic transmission of information. It's also about husbandry, and it's also about care and craft in the technique that you use. So all I was trying to say in the end is that both, you're absolutely right. That's who these farmers are. These are new, and that's what I was sort of joking with Gabe about. These are a bunch of folks in North Carolina that are, as everybody would say, is from New Jersey, right? I mean, they have come and they are displacing a local population, or maybe they just can get access to the land, and they're interested in the science and the geography and the history of this region, and they're trying to craft a place for themselves in place by virtue of their connection to these pigs, whose place in this area also has to be crafted. I mean, I'm not sure what it is about a shipwrecked Spanish pig that gives it heritage in North Carolina, other than heritage breeders breeding them. And that's what I was trying to get at, that both of them together are crafting a sense of their commitment to place in this area. They're both invasive species, right? They're both invasive breeds, right? As people and as pigs, right? So I totally agree with that, your assessment. And that is, in fact, a very real risk that people I know with who are good breeders really, really worry about, right? That somebody's going to run down the genetics of these animals.
So if I can invite Mark back to the front. We have time for 2 or 3 more questions for either of the panelists, and then I will have to cut us off. So we'll take the 2 or 3 questions and let the answers come.
So I'm going to take a quick second and plug Mark's book for him. It's really good. I recommend it to all of you. And my question is, you end the book talking about how we should the path forward is that we should accept that pork just shouldn't be as cheap as it is. And so that's sort of like a consumer approach that we talked about some yesterday, and trying to get people who can afford it to pay more. And I'm not as worried about the social injustice aspects of that, because I think currently the externalities of our commercial hog industry are being borne disproportionately by impoverished minority communities. So that's injustice as well. So I think people should be paying more for pork and eating less of it, but I'm not necessarily as optimistic that that is going to actually pave a path forward that is better. And so, we only have so much capacity. So I'm spending a lot of my capacity taking sort of more of a marketing and education approach, trying to produce such a good quality pork product and being able to try to scream it from the rooftops and educate people about why it's better to get them to pay more for it. But then you could also spend your time focusing on changing regulation and trying to approach it that way. So do you think we should put sort of most of our emphasis on trying to get people to pay more? Should we, how do we appropriately spend our time to try to create this better path forward? Return to the beginning, like you talk about.
Are there any other questions? Great. Well, I'll let you both respond, and then we'll be done.
I would say the consumer model in the States is about the only viable model, because the chances of there being any regulatory changes are almost nil. So there's a reason that people in the industry call this niche meat. I mean, I think it's always going to be small. I think it can get bigger, but I don't think it's going to get vastly bigger. And so I would say that your model of educating people and persuading people, there are improvements that could be made simply as demand increases. You can get economies of scale, such as those realized by Nyman Ranch and a couple of others on a smaller scale. But then again, as we also learned about Nyman Ranch, with scale comes a move towards industrialization, which increases, which raises the chances of other problems. So, yeah, keep doing what you're doing.
If I can jump in on that too, my feeling is sort of all hands on deck. I mean, any sort of, there's no perspective that I think is not potentially fruitful, basically because it is such an uphill slog. The one thing I would say about regulation is, and North Carolina is just a classic example of this. I mean, it was really in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, there was a very clear, concerted, and well-funded effort to get big. And that took some very specific pieces of legislation that had astronomical, overwhelming effects. And one might say, well, it may take some pieces of legislation to correct that. And that, so it's not, I mean, these are socially and politically constructed systems, and it will take social and political movements to move them back. Am I optimistic about that? Not in the short term, nor am I optimistic about niche markets either. I mean, for the very same reasons that they're at the level of scale. I mean, they can, education can be effective, but and efforts to expand direct marketing, for example, can be effective, but they are by definition. I mean, direct marketing by definition is a really small scale operation. I've worked with a couple, and I know that Mark knows as well. There's some folks who are doing some really interesting stuff in aggregating and trying to reach out to people who have hardly any animals at all and create markets for them and make it possible for them to actually, if not make a living, at least make money off of the production of their stock. And that, what I like about those efforts is they really are very conscientious about scale. And the recognition that, the farm like this one is one of the most successful farms in the Piedmont in North Carolina, and if they have 80 customers, they're really happy, right? So what can we do to get, to reach out to 300 customers as opposed to 80? So again, as I say, all hands on deck. I'm just happy to have anybody.
That's a similar model to what I'm doing,
Yeah.
to aggregate people in New England, but
Yeah.
sometimes regulation just feels like it's.
I agree. I think it's I think that's part of what that's what makes us feel as though it is going to continue to be a niche. At a certain level, I don't think Smithfield cares at all about whether people buy niche market pork. It's like, That's fine. We'll come up with some other way to sell it to you, right? Or we won't even, we don't really even care about pork. We just care about the financial structures and the debts and the contracts that we're working on. I mean, the meat is totally secondary, right? So to me, that's beyond pessimistic. That's just nihilistic. But I think it's not untrue.
So I'm going to give Jim the last word, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
It's a heavy burden. I just had a simple question, which is, one wonders whether in the long run, given agribusiness and its deep pockets, whether one is going to have a situation in which small-scale heritage breed artisanal producers end up tailoring the structure of their business and their marketing model and so on in order to become attractive enough to be swallowed by a larger agribusiness. And in the kind of software industry, that is the kind of model. You simply dress for the dance, convince the people that you've got something that may be worth something or worth swallowing so it doesn't become worth something. And so that is a kind of backward colonization of the business model of artisanal production that seems to me to have some disturbing consequences.
The aggregator that I was talking about there's a couple of women that run this company, and one of them was telling me that she had recently been to a small conference for startups, and she was totally dismayed because of exactly that model. That these are a bunch of people who had invented some apps and some software, and what they really hoped, they couldn't wait for Microsoft to just swoop in and give them, make them all a fortune. And she wanted just the opposite of that. She wanted to just continue to grow small and spread with using the exact same model that she had. But she realized there wasn't even an infrastructure that was out there to support that notion. That's not what business is supposed to be about. I think that's part of what makes people wary about the commercialization of heritage itself. Make people sort of feel like, well, that's, and there will be, Smithfield in 2009 came out with a line of pasture pork. It didn't go very far. They sort of realized, they got overextended in their brands, but they were like, oh, well, it is after all just one more niche. So that's great. We can market that. In that way, it'll work fine.
And I'd say and anytime that happens, like to the extent that that's a model that works, it creates a new opening for somebody else who's going to brand themselves as that much more authentic. And I'd also, this touches on what Jennifer said before as well, that, I actually think that there maybe is a possibility of persuading people to buy more expensive meat, simply because food is never just sustenance. Food always has a lot of symbolic value, among them status. And some people are buying well-raised pork because it conveys status upon them, and I don't have any problem with that. And it's the thing about status is that people tend to aspire to higher levels of status. So if that is what it takes to persuade people to buy more of the kind of pork you're raising, then even an anti-elitist like me is comfortable with that.
So I want to thank both, and we'll now take a break for 10 minutes and come back.